My first rule, and it's a guiding rule in terms of how we're sharing our time with each other. When I say sharing our time, I actually mean sharing our time. Sometimes when we open spaces for these kinds of conversations, because we don't often have them, people want to share a lot. And in wanting to share a lot, I mean, we have how many people in the room today? Over 50. If we all decided we wanted to share a lot, it could make it difficult for us to really get through the conversation and also hold space for each other. So with that being said, I'm going to, when people are sharing, or I'm going to try to limit people's comments to about 3 minutes. So that will maybe help us to sort of ensure that everybody is able to participate if they want to participate. And I'm also going to ask people to use the chat as well. I know I love talking about anti-Black racism and really engaging this conversation. So I too can go on. So I'm also going to try to hold on to this rule as well, in terms of just making sure that I'm getting us through some of the content. That being said, the goal for today is not to learn everything about anti-Black racism at all, because it's definitely not possible within a 2-hour window. But we want to make sure that as many people that want to participate can participate without anybody maybe taking up too much space that we should be sharing with each other. The second thing I really want us to think about is how we're asking our questions and how we're sharing our comments. And so questions and comments should not deflect, dismiss, diminish, or deny another person's experience. And what I mean by that is, we're in a learning space. So it's important for us to, engage in asking questions and ensure that we can share our comments. But when those comments or questions happen at the expense of other people, then the way that we are asking the question or the way that we are sharing the comment isn't productive to the conversation that we're trying to have today, right? We want to learn about anti-Black racism, but we don't want to learn about it at the expense of the people who are in the room. So when we're asking our questions, we want to make sure we're not trying to deflect from the conversation we're having because maybe we're feeling uncomfortable. We're not trying to dismiss somebody else's experience. We're not trying to diminish somebody else's experience, and we're not trying to deny somebody else's experience. And sometimes what this looks like, I can give you an example, is if somebody shares something, or if I share something, and then somebody says, well, I have Black friends and they don't experience this. Right. And so what that's doing is it's dismissing the thing that I've just shared. And so there's a different way to ask that question, which is, I've not heard about this before. Can I get more information about it? Or can you share more with me? Right. It's this, you're getting the same information at the end of the day, but you're asking the question in a different way, that it's not at the expense at myself or other Black people who are in the room, or other racialized people who might be sharing their experiences. So those are my two. I'm hoping that folks want to add anything else, you can share it in the chat. Sorry, excuse me. So I'm going to start off with a bit of an activity. I'm going to ask folks if you can think about and locate where you are within this journey. So this chart is about becoming anti-racist and the different zones that exist in terms of becoming anti-racist, right? And so this chart sort of outlines 3 different areas: the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. And the reason why I like to start with this activity is because all of us are on our journey when it comes to anti-Black, when it comes to anti-racism, when it comes to anti-Black racism. We're not all in the same place. Some people are still in the fear zone, some people are in the learning zone, and some folks are in the growth zone. It's important to be able to locate where you are in this journey, because that kind of gives you an indication of how you can participate in this workshop. What are you trying to gain by being in this workshop? Are you trying to go from the fear zone to the learning zone to the growth zone? And if you're able to locate yourself, it also gives you an indication of, like, how can you support those around you as well? One of the other things that's important about being able to locate that we're on this journey is because, if we assume that everybody's in the same space in terms of this work, then we're assuming that we're all entering the conversation at the same place. And that's one of the biggest challenges with doing anti-racism work or anti-Black racism work. There's an assumption that we all know what we're talking about. There's an assumption that, particularly, for example, Black people are experts in this work. And I'm going to define what I mean by experts and people that have a lived experience. Those are two different things. And so it's really important for us to think about, where am I in this journey? For many of us Black people, the assumption is because we have a lived experience, we are also experts, meaning we have the right language and the right supports to be able to talk about anti-Black racism in a way that that demonstrates an expertise. Now, a lived experience can contribute to an expertise and can enhance an expertise, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have that expertise. And so, for example, many of us have a lived experience of driving a car. But if something is wrong with the car, we will take it to a mechanic, somebody who has an expertise to fix the car. And so I want us to think about doing anti-racism work and anti-Black racism in that same way. While many of us have a lived experience, we don't necessarily have the tools and the resources to be able to solve anti-Black racism, but we have that lived experience. There are those of us who have done the work and who are in the growth zone of learning about, how do we confront anti-Black racism? What are the tools and resources and the language that we use to have this conversation? Another thing that's really important about just this kind of an assessment and reframing how we're thinking about anti-racism and anti-Black racism is that it helps us to think about who's also around us. Who are we learning from? Are we constantly learning from other people who have a lived experience, but not necessarily an expertise? Or are we learning from people who have an expertise and also a lived experience? And, these things are very important in terms of how we do the work and our ability to actually make change within the structures that we're trying to see. So I want folks to maybe take 1 minute really quickly and think through, and I hope everybody can see the slide. So maybe I'll just read out some of the points from each one of the zones. And so in the fear zone, we have, I deny racism as a problem. I avoid hard questions. I strive to be comfortable. I talk to others who look and think like me. In the learning zone, I recognize racism as a present and current problem. I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. I understand my own privilege in ignoring racism. I educate myself about race and structural racism. I am vulnerable about my own biases and knowledge gaps, and I listen to others who think and look differently than me. In the growth zone, I identify how I may unknowingly benefit from racism. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. I sit with my own discomfort. I speak out when I see racism in action. I educate my peers how racism harms our profession. I don't let mistakes deter me from being better. I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized, and I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me. The other piece that I actually want to note is that sometimes you can be in the growth zone, but sometimes you can be in the learning zone, and sometimes you can be in the fear zone. While I consider myself an expert in talking about anti-Black racism, I can acknowledge that when it comes to the diversity of Black people, I might still be in the learning zone, or I am for sure in the learning zone. When it comes to Black LGBTQS folks, I can't speak to that experience in a way that I would call myself an expert. So I would put myself in the learning zone for that. When it comes to Black people who might be living with a disability, I would put myself in the learning zone for that. When it comes to Indigenous or Afro-Indigenous anti-Black racism that impacts Afro-Indigenous people, I would put myself in the learning zone for that, because I don't have enough expertise to be able to speak to these things in a way that puts me in the growth zone. So again, you can be in different spaces at different times when it comes to this. And so if people can maybe in the chat really quickly think about, where are you in this chart? Where are you in the fear zone, learning zone, growth zone? If a couple of people want to share, that's fine. Or if you want to just use the chat so we can get a sense of where are folks in the room. Okay, I have a hand up from Babatunde.
For me personally, it's being in the learning zone. I think I believe I push myself more to learn as regards anti-racism and stuff every day, but with the current tide of what happens in terms of news, in terms of events, in terms of information, particularly over the media, it's more of expecting the unexpected and maybe a flicker into the fear zone at times because of the magnitude of things that happen, what you hear across the media. in terms of maybe something coming out and then it's been on for years and then the media brings it out and then, lots of information as to the government or an association. So it's constantly learning for me. And most times I flicker into the fear zone because I really don't know what else would happen again into the future. We're living with so much in terms of the past and also the present in terms of what happens to individuals in this fair, and it's scary, if I must put it that way. So growth zone, no, it's for me, it's as much as possible learning, but flickers of the fear zone as to information that happens as per time. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think what you shared is actually really important around the fear zone, because sometimes the assumption is that people are in the fear zone because they don't want to be anti-racist. And the reasons why people might be in the fear zone vary. It's not because we don't want to be anti-racist, but sometimes there's a difficulty that allows us to actually be anti-racist. There are barriers that allow us to be anti-racist. There are fears that many of us have that allow us to be anti-racist. And so we end up in the fear zone because it's our comfort zone, right? It's the place where we feel comfortable. It's the place where we feel less anxious. And so we stay there because of some of those challenges as well. For some reason I can't see the chat, so I don't know if there are comments coming up in the chat. Maybe Sarah, Jillian, Kemi, or Mahad, you can just read out anything that might be important. If it's folks just identifying, then that's cool. We can move on to the next slide.
So there's quite a few comments. People just identifying where they're positioning themselves. So I think we've got a lot of folks who are identifying themselves in the learning zone, some in the growth zone. Some also speaks about being in both, feeling that they're in both those spaces. So I think that's where we are. Susanna, you've raised your hand. Do you want to unmute and share?
I just had a question. It just came to me in terms of, would you consider someone to be in the growth zone for someone who, for an example, not growth, sorry, fear zone. So myself, I considered myself to be in the learning zone. However, would you say for someone who doesn't go and say, I'm going to sit down with policymakers and, talk about, what's going on with the policy, changing policies that might be impacting, the Black community. Would you say that's someone who's sitting in fear? Would you consider those people to only be in the growth section? Because I'm seeing things like, I sit with my discomfort, like speaking out. Yes, I'm going to speak out when I see racism, but if I'm not sitting down and saying, you know what, there's a meeting going on, I'm going to sit with John Tory and say, this is what's impacting all the staff. You know what I mean? I don't see enough staff. What would you consider that? Because I want to know, the balance.
Yeah, and I think it's a really great question, especially because it's about from where you sit, what are you doing that's action oriented? For me, I think being in the learning zone, you are still gaining information that's going to equip you to being action oriented, whatever that space is that you're in. If you don't have enough information, it actually makes it hard for you to be action oriented, right? Because you don't have the right language. So while most of us know racism is wrong, not all of us know how to act on that, right? A common thing that constantly happens is somebody will say something problematic, like, it's a microaggression. Somebody will say to them, that's a microaggression, or you shouldn't say that. And the person will be like, why shouldn't I say that? It was just a joke. And then you're like, well, no, you shouldn't say it, it's wrong. And they're like, why? Why shouldn't I say it? Why is it wrong? And you don't have enough information to actually tell them. So while we know it's wrong, we don't all have the language to be able to talk about it. For me, when I started my journey around anti-Black racism, I remember I was in university and I always used to say, I hate white people. I always used to say that. I would be like, I hate white people because I didn't have the language to actually say, white supremacy is creating these kind of outcomes. There are systems and there are structures that are creating these kinds of outcomes for people that look like me. I didn't have that language at the time. So I would say, I hate white people because that was the language that I had. And so when we're talking about the growth zone, it's about being able to have the language and being in the spaces that allow you to be action oriented. And so, no, you're not, the expectation is not that you can access policy spaces or John Tory, but in the space that you're in, are you action oriented in that space? If you're a Delta family staff, what are you doing within the organization that puts you in the growth zone, right? Are you advocating to see more programming for example, LGBTQ Black folks or folks that are living with a disability? So being able to have the language to do that is what's important, right? And so I'm not sure if, sorry, Susanna, is that sort of helping with your question?
No, 1,000. I would say 1,000%, because I think that is a huge issue I seen with myself earlier. Still, I would say now with just specifically even language, even when I speak to my friends, when we speak about this subject, you know, when we're sitting down with those people, if we were going to sit down and have a meeting with, again, example, a John Tory, you know, and you want to be equipped with the right information to be having that conversation and then not get hit back, you know what I mean, due to the fact that you're out of anger. Yes, it's wrong. Yes, we should have some more people like that, but are you saying it in the right way? That's gonna be like, okay, well, due to the reason I see that XYZ, you know what I mean? So I think that is sometimes I find like a fear, because I'm just like, okay, you know, this is crazy, like, you know what I mean? But then I'm like, Susanna, make sure you're not gonna go to that person and be like, this is crazy, and then be like, let me tell you, like, are you crazy? Do you see what's going on? You know what I mean? And then it's just like, let me just sit back. But then when I look at this chart, I'm like, oh shit, like, you know, I'm sitting in fear right now when I should be sitting, you know, so thank you, it helps.
Quickly to that, and I'm going to move us on in a little bit, but you know, it's when you're in that fear, you can see that it says that you strive to be comfortable. So the fear makes us anxious, and then we try to be comfortable. That prevents us from speaking out, right? Like, it's the reason why when somebody says something problematic, sometimes some of us will just laugh and we'll walk away, like, even though we know we want to say something, but we want to make ourselves uncomfortable because it actually does make us anxious when we're hearing things that we know are wrong, but we don't know how to engage them. And so for those of us that are in the learning zone, it becomes really important to say, how am I gaining the information that I need in order for me to move into the growth zone? And you know what? If I acknowledge that I'm in the growth zone and I'm not the right person to have the conversation, how do I rely on experts who are in the growth zone to have the conversation, right? So you don't always have to be the person. And I think that's one of the barriers that we face. And sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead in the presentation, but it's okay. We're going to go with it. You don't always have to be the advocate. You don't always have to be the person, because sometimes that causes more harm to yourself and to the cause, right? Because you don't have the right language. So think about somebody like me talking to, let's say, Mayor Tory, and saying like, yeah, I hate white people are racist. And I'm going, that is not productive, actually. And I'm putting myself in a harmful position by having that kind of conversation when I'm not ready and I don't have the language. But when I do have the language and I am ready, I can have that conversation in a way that talks about structures, that talks about outcomes, that talks about impact. And that's where we start to see a change happening in terms of how we're doing the work. But historically, what has happened is that many people rely on people who are still in the learning zone to have these conversations. Many organizations don't have experts necessarily in their organization, so they look for that person with the lived experience and assume that that person can also speak in a kind of way, and that creates other kinds of impacts that create burnout for a lot of staff, frustration, and it becomes harmful to ourselves, right? So really important to think about, where are you? What can you do from where you're at? And who's around you that helps you to go from fear zone to learning zone, and from learning zone to growth zone, right? Really important to sort of like think about those. Babatunde, is there a really quick comment? Because I just want to move us on to the next slide and activity.
Oh, very quick. So
Okay.
For the fear zone, I would not identify with all the subheads in the fear zone. So what I mean when I say most times I stay in the fear zone is I'm human. So the element of fear will come in at any point in time. It is what I use the fear for action-wise that determines what springs next for me. So it's not as if it's not as if the fear doesn't come. it comes. So how long does it stay with me, and what do I use it for? What do I use it for to jump from that space to another? That's what it just says for me.
Right. And then, so you do see, like in the growth zone, it says, I don't let my mistakes deter me from being better. Because one of the things that actually stops a lot of people from doing this kind of work is that they're afraid of making a mistake. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And so because of that fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, you just don't do anything at all. Right. And so in the growth zone, you still have a fear, but you don't let that fear or those mistakes actually deter you from doing better. And so thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move us on to the next slide, if that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to see how this is going to work. Let's see. If it's not working, we'll just pivot a bit. But I want us to use the whiteboard. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the whiteboard in Zoom. And I'll just walk you through a bit how we're going to use the whiteboard to collaborate and have a conversation. So I'm going to create 3 categories here. Sorry for those of you who've called in, you probably won't be able to participate, but there's this sticky note option. So you can place a sticky note and then you can type a message in the sticky note, okay? And we're gonna spend a little bit of time on this, but let me delete this for now. The first question I have for folks, and also feel free to participate in the chat if for some reason you cannot use the whiteboard. What do we know about Black people? Okay, I see somebody already tested out the sticky. So I want you to, if folks can either in the chat or using the whiteboard, start to sort of respond to this question. What do we know about Black people? So we're thinking positives, negatives, stereotypes. What do we know about Black people, and what do we know about the Black experience? And I'm just testing this out. If it's not working for people, we'll move on and try it a different way.
Is anyone having a problem with the stickies? Are we good?
Okay, yeah, I have people. Okay, some people are moving around my lines, but no worries. It's okay. I'll remake them. Let's just see how. Okay, so I have, we don't know our history. I have, we are diverse in the chat. Oh, no worries, don't worry. If we mess it up, we can fix it. I have creative and able to, okay, still writing multiple identities and experiences of Blackness. Sorry, I'll mute that person. Okay, I have strong and resilient, creative, rich culture. I want you all to think about the totality of the Black experience, because I'm seeing a lot of positives, and I know why you're sharing the positives, but I want us to think about the totality of the Black experience and how can we sort of capture that in terms of what we know about Black people. I have feared and overlooked in the chat. Okay, I have internalized racism makes us our own enemies, reactionary, oppressed, and marginalized. I have passionate. Okay, and then feel free to keep sharing on this one. I'm gonna ask another one, but you know what? I think there's too many people to use the whiteboard. So let's do this a different way. I had a really cool idea, but it might not work because there's too many people in the workshop. But feel free to continue using the whiteboard. But the second question that I have for you all is, how do we know what we know about Black people? Okay, so I have the media, I have lived experience. We talk amongst ourselves, so from each other, experience, over 400 years of slavery. So I think that might be about the first point there. Media, collaborations, media, literature, history class, observation. So Sharon, when you say observation, do you mean observing each other, or observing just by watching people? School, from family. Okay, from watching each other. Sorry, I'm seeing some more coming in. Okay, family, personal experience. And so based off of, okay, traveling, based off of what we know and how we know it, which I've seen the majority of it being a couple of things. Media is what I've seen come up a few times. I have history and I have experience. So based off of those two, based off of those things, what is the impact of what we know about Black people and where we learn about Black people? What is the impact of that? How does that impact us? Not just the Black people that are in the room, but other folks. How does it impact how we, how does that impact being Black, what we know about Black people? Okay, so Candace said we don't necessarily know truths and facts. And so could we say that that's limiting? Right. Okay. So then I see can stunt growth. I see stereotypes and assumptions. Access to quality of education for Black youth. In terms of media, we need to assess who has the power to write such stories and narratives. It creates fear. Okay, so the impact of what we know about Black people creates fear. I like that. I think Vera's point around media and assessing who has the power to write such narratives is really important, because I think what I'm getting from that is that the media portrays Black people in a limiting light. Mahad says no one wants to be Black as one of them. Single story narrative, skepticism, caution. What I was trying to demonstrate with this activity, and I think you all are sort of getting the point, is so what we know about Black people is informed by a power dynamic that is actually grounded in white supremacy, right? Who gets to tell the story about what it means to be Black? Who gets to talk about what it means to be Black, and how does that get popularized for all of us, those of us who are Black, racialized? And I know there's some folks that come from different countries here, as you know, we're very diverse in Toronto. So even what we learn from back home about what it means to be about the Black experience, for example, for most people, that actually comes from American culture, right? We learn about Blackness through a very American kind of lens because of the ways in which American popular culture really dominates the media, right? And so our perception of what it means to be Black, it's coming from very few sources, right? Very few information sources. The media, and the media is dominated by the Black American experience. And so there's always this assumption that all Black people are Black Americans for some reason. That's very interesting. And then there's also the pieces around, sorry, let me go back. This misinformation, right? And so the misinformation, it creates a dynamic that has an impact. Right. And so when we talk about the impact of that what we know about Black people, the impact of that is that we act based off of what we know. Even those of us who are Black, those of us who are racialized, we act based off of what we know, because if we don't know anything else, then it makes it difficult for us to act in a different way. And so I really want us to start the conversation that way. And throughout this conversation, I want us to challenge ourselves to think about, what do I know about Black people? Where did I learn this information? And how does that impact how even me as a Black person, how that impacts me, and how does that impact people that are around me? And those of you who are non-Black, what do you know about Black people? Where did you learn about this experience? And how does that impact how you interact with Black people, how you provide service for Black people, how you think about Black people? How does what you know connect to the impact? And then the last question I want to leave folks with is, have you ever stopped to ask yourself that question? Where did I learn this? Where did I learn this particular idea, stereotype? Where did I get this information from? And have you taken the time to actually think about that and think to yourself, is this actually the truth? Or is this information that I received in a way that I was never even aware? Okay, so I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen, and I'm gonna start getting into the second part of the workshop. So in order for us to even talk about anti-Black racism, which is the topic for today, we actually have to talk about race and racism at a more generic level. And I've done a very quick, and this is not doing service to the history of race and racism, but for the sake of time, I wanted us to sort of think about how race and racism come to be historically. Because one of the other challenges is that we face is that oftentimes we're having these conversations as if they're disconnected from this history that produces race and racism. Race and racism just didn't appear out of nowhere today. They have this historical context that's very important in terms of having the conversation. So through slavery and colonialism and European conquest, Europeans actively sought to control people and resources of the world. Many of us know this. Through these conquests, power was used to produce and maintain racial categories, create laws to govern the entire functioning of systems, laws that reflected and protected their beliefs and interests, determined which races had access to resources and also were considered full human, including who had access to citizenship, which often spoke to who had access to land, employment, education, and freedom. And through these processes, created versions of society around the world that benefited and reflected Europeans. And so these historical conditions produce modern day relations of power and privilege. And while these are common things that many of us know, because this is common knowledge today, being able to connect this conversation to this history that produced a society that really that benefited Europeans and reflected European ideologies, the ways in which white supremacy comes to be real, it's over these historical practices that happened over time. And so please remember this as we're having this conversation. And sorry, again, I can't see the chat. So if there's any questions or anything coming up, I'm gonna need some of the co-hosts to sort of like help me out.
Yeah, I'm just gonna be like typing stuff into the chat just to sort of reinforce whatever you're talking about. So just put that.
Thank you. Okay, and so what is racism? Many of us know what it is. Actions or attitudes, conscious or unconscious, that subordinate an individual or group based on skin color or race, and it can be acted individually, structurally, institutionally, and systemically. This manifests in several ways, including unconscious bias, stereotypes and tropes, racist attitudes and beliefs. And so when we go back to this slide here, where the historical, the history tells us that Europeans created versions of societies that benefited them, that protected their beliefs and interests. And then we go back to thinking about what racism means. It means these structures, the institutions, and the systems were created to reflect these benefits, things that benefited Europeans, right? And so really connecting those things. Institutions were created in a way that validated, reinforced, and benefited Europeans. Systems were created in that same kind of way, and so were the individual behavior then reflected these pieces. Why does this change when it comes to, actually, sorry, I just went ahead of myself. So I'm gonna give you some historical Canadian examples of how these systems and structures were created when European colonizers came to Canada, right? And so when we look at Canadian law historically, there are a few different examples we can look at. There was in 1912, passing of an act to prevent the employment of female labor in certain capacities in Saskatchewan. This is otherwise known as the White Woman Labor Law, wherein white women working for Chinese men was viewed as a criminal offense due to white women being vulnerable and needing to be protected, oh, there's a typo there, from non-white men. This statute was actually motivated largely by anti-immigration and racist attitudes and white workers' concerns about competitive pricing of Chinese goods and services. So I'm going to take us back. We're talking about, we talked about how Europeans were creating this version of society that benefited them. As many of us know, Chinese immigration was welcomed in Canada to help build the railroad. So at that time, immigration was welcomed from Chinese labor. When this Chinese labor started to actually present as a competition for white business owners, there was this law that was enacted in order to protect their interests. And while that law was under this guise of wanting to protect these vulnerable white women, it was really a way to protect the interests of the white businessmen who the Chinese business owners were presenting competition for. So again, this law was literally created as a way to deter, as a way to disadvantage Chinese shopkeepers. And people are often like very sort of surprised, but this was a law that was on the books. If you Google like white woman labor law, you will see this is something that was on our books. In 1914, we have the Komagata Maru, where people from India were detained on the Komagata Maru ship for 2 months and then denied entry into Canada. And this was known as the Continuous Journey Regulation, which was part of the Immigration Act. And the goal of this was to actually deter immigration that was immigrants who were coming from India and Japan, because at the time there was no journey that would allow you to come to Canada continuously from India and Japan without stopping. So the Continuous Journey Regulation stated that you had to have a direct route to Canada. You couldn't stop. And so while in its language, it didn't say, you can't come to Canada if you are from India or Japan, because the government at the time knew that people coming from Japan and India had to stop. Mainly, I think it was in Hawaii, they implemented this continuous journey regulation as a way to deter deter immigrants coming from these two countries. During World War II, Ukrainian Canadians were branded as enemy aliens. Thousands were interned and had to wear special identification badges. 1939, Canada refused entry to thousands of Jewish refugees escaping persecution by Nazis. They were sent back, and 3/4 of them died at the hands of the Nazis. One thing that's really interesting about Canada's response to the Holocaust is actually that Canada took in, of all countries, Canada took in the least amount of Jewish refugees. And one of the famous quotes that was made by the Prime Minister at the time is when he was asked, how many Jewish people would you let come into Canada? He said, none is too many. And this was a public comment that he made. So the anti-Semitism that was happening in Canada at the time was publicly accepted in a way where even the Prime Minister could make this kind of comment. What's interesting about this as well, and remember I was saying creating a version of society that benefited Europeans, the Jewish people that were actually allowed to come into Canada were largely academics and scientists who their knowledge and their experiences were seen as beneficial to Canada. And so those were the kinds of people that got in. And again, during World War II, there was the forcible expulsion and confinement of ethnic Japanese, also known as Japanese internment. And so I'm sharing these examples to give you a sense of when we're talking about the ways in which these systems over time and the ways in which Europeans created systems, laws, and practices that benefited them. These are the real life examples that happened in Canadian history. And we really want to think about sort of if these are the laws that were on the books and, created this version of Canada that benefited Europeans, how does that kind of continue to show up today? Does it continue to show up today? So I want to move into talking about anti-Black racism, then I'm going to make a connection between the two that I hope will be helpful for folks. So anti-Black racism, like racism, is prejudice, its attitudes, its beliefs, its stereotyping, and its discrimination, but it's directed at people of African descent and grounded in white supremacy. And, that's obviously not a surprise. Anti-Black racism dehumanizes Black people and is rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization, which continues to impact Black people today. This manifests in several ways, including unconscious bias, stereotypes, tropes of Black people, and racist attitudes and beliefs. Let me break down this definition for you a little bit before we actually move on. So when we say anti-Black racism is rooted in the unique experience of enslavement and colonization, those two pieces are actually the very crucial part of this definition. And the impact that it continues to have on Black people today is also very important in terms of why we need to name anti-Black racism specifically as something that manifests itself differently from racism that impacts other groups of people. This is not to say that other groups of people don't experience racism. It's really to acknowledge the contemporary impact that anti-Black racism still has on Black people today based off of this history. So when we think about slavery, the system of slavery was successful, particularly transatlantic slavery that lasted, as somebody mentioned before, over 400 years, and was particularly successful because the ideas, the stereotypes, and the narratives that were created about Black people that allowed them to be enslaved dehumanized Black people. And that was key to the system of slavery being successful. Right? The narratives needed to dehumanize Black people, say that Black people, Africans specifically and West Africans specifically, are not human and can therefore be used as slaves. And so what kind of, maybe we can really quickly in the chat and I'll stop sharing for a second. What kind of narratives say somebody is not human? Like what kinds of things would we say about somebody to say that they're not human? Yeah, sure. One of the really important ones that I like to share is, and I saw it when we did the exercise initially, is that Black people are strong, right? That is usually sort of used as a compliment for Black people, very strong. But that narrative of strength actually superhuman strength was used to dehumanize Black people during the slave trade, right? So because these people are so strong, they don't feel pain, they can therefore endure this amount of labor that other people cannot, right? And so that was one of the ways in which Black people were dehumanized during slavery. The strength, our ability to be strong and endure pain, for example. And so that allowed for the kind of labor that we saw during the transatlantic slave trade. Why is that important today? We actually see that a consequence of that stereotype, that narrative that dehumanized Black people for over 400 years shows up in our healthcare system today, right? Lots of research demonstrates that Black people are prescribed pain medication less than non-Black people. Black people's pain is not believed when they are going to the doctor, going to the hospital. And yes, like what was just mentioned in the chat, Black women die at rates during childbirth because doctors are not listening to their pain. So interestingly enough, there was a study that actually talked to medical students, and they were asking medical students, why are you prescribing pain medication less to Black people? And the response that the researcher found was that there was this perception that because Black people had darker skin, their skin was then thicker and could then feel less pain. That was something that actually came out through this research. And that is literally a narrative that came out that was an idea that happened during slavery. This is something that said darker skin can endure more pain. And that narrative shows up today in our healthcare system. And I'm getting some examples in the chat that are really helpful. So I'm hoping folks are paying attention to this, because this is not, this thing that we're just talking about that's not connected from people's realities, right? Like literally people, those of us that engage in the traditional healthcare system, we have these experiences where it takes us longer to be diagnosed, where we're getting prescribed pain medication in different ways than other people who are not Black. And this specific experience that we see continues to show up today is directly connected to this experience of slavery. Another reason, yes, thank you for all the examples that are coming up in the chat. Another example, a narrative that comes out of slavery is broken Black families, right? Black people don't know how to have families, so that allows Europeans to separate Black families, right? Your children can be taken away from you because you don't value the traditional family system, the same one that we value. And so when you have children, you don't really care about these children and we can take them away, right? And so all of these narratives around how do we dehumanize these people so that we can use them in the ways that we need to for this kind of labor are connected to what we see today. Because what do we see today around Black families, right? Black people are overrepresented, Black and Indigenous people are overrepresented in the child welfare system. We know CAS is called way more times on Black families than other families. If you see a Black woman pushing a stroller, the assumption is that she's a single Black parent because for whatever reason, Black women are not coming from two-parent households. And even if people are coming from single-parent households, there's a ways in which even that's used to say these women are no good, even though we know that many households only have are led by women, for example, single women, but the same kind of trope doesn't get used against non-Black people in the same kind of way, right? So again, connecting these particular outcomes that we see today to that history of slavery that really was a over 400-year period of dehumanizing Black people. And those same narratives continue to show up today in terms of the outcomes that we see for Black people. Yes, I see Sharon has added, and sorry if I might be Sharon, sorry, but less intelligent. We can name lots and lots of things, stereotypes and ideas that have been used to dehumanize Black people all the time. And with each one that you share, we can actually connect it back to that system of slavery. And then we can connect it back to our contemporary moment to actually show how it's impacting the outcomes that we see for Black people today. So when we talk about anti-Black racism, and the reason why I even started with the generic examples of racism is because even though Chinese people have faced a lot of racism in Canada historically, even though brown South Asian folks have experienced a lot of racism in Canada, even though Italians, people, Jewish people, all of these groups of people have experienced lots of racism in Canada. When we look at the outcomes that exist today for those groups of people, they are doing better, right, than Black people. And we can say, well, what is wrong with Black people that we're not able to figure it out? But when we look at that history of slavery that dehumanized, not attempted to, but successfully dehumanized Black people over a period of 400 years, it tells us why the outcomes today for Black people look the way that they do. Again, this is not to create an oppression Olympics or to say that other people of different races are not experiencing racism. It's a way for us to focus on the outcomes that we see today for Black people, to say, you know, what is going on here? Like, and to stop actually blaming individual Black people for the issues that the outcomes that we see, and to connect it back to this history, because that's what's really going to allow us to equip ourselves to actually work to eradicate and confront anti-Black racism in a meaningful way. So I have a hand up. Mahad, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was gonna provide an anecdote. We have a family friend, they're Pakistani, and we've been friends like for like I think during my whole life. My mom knew them like before I was born, and we were having like lunch with them like a while back, and it was interesting. I just brought up like the idea, like I brought up Black women, but I was talking about something else. And then his reaction, like the guy is like my age, his reaction, automatic reaction was almost like, oh, they have a lot of children or single mothers. Like he just popped out of his mouth, right? Like I was talking about something totally different. And then like single mothers or a lot of kids just popped out of his mouth. And I was like, this stuff is like in your unconscious, right? So you gotta be careful.
Yeah. And you know, that's why that's part of the definition, right? Like the unconscious part. You know, anti-Black racism is air that we all breathe in, right? Like as soon as you're actually born into the society, as soon as you enter into the society, you are automatically breathing in this, and you don't even realize it. It just exists somewhere in your subconscious. Even those of us who are Black, those of us who are non-Black, these ideas and narratives exist in our minds. Because one of the things we identified in the activity is that we're getting most of our information about Black people from the media. We cannot pretend that doesn't have an impact on us. So every time, and you know what, in the 90s and 80s and so on, there were a lot of shows that where it was a single Black woman who was the parent, right? It was, and let's contrast that a little bit. In the 90s, there were, and maybe some of us are old enough to sort of share some of the shows that we used to watch in the 90s, but there were a lot of shows that demonstrated incompetent white families, right? The Simpsons, Married with Children, maybe like Roseanne. Sorry, I don't know if people are, and now I'm dating myself, and you guys probably can figure out how old I am. But there were all of these shows that actually showed like these white heads of household, particularly the men, who were incompetent. But many of us don't look at all white men and just assume that they are incompetent, right? We don't just assume that they all act like Homer Simpson. We don't all assume that they all will behave like Al Bundy, I think was his name in that show, right? And why is that? We have so many other representations of what it means to be a white man, right? That we don't automatically assume that this one representation that we have is a reflection of all white men. You know, even factually speaking, when we think about who serial killers are, factually on TV, who are serial killers? If we had to identify, please, people put it in the chat. What is the identity of a serial killer? Usually white. Thank you, Deanna. Usually white, not just white people, usually a white man, right? That's factually true. But when most of us walk by white men on the street, our assumption is not that they are a serial killer, right? We don't right away go to that place. Our brain doesn't automatically go there. But when we see a Black woman pushing a stroller, our brain automatically goes to, she must be a single Black parent. She must be a single mother. What's happening with these two different experiences? Well, there wasn't a 400-year over time period where where this narrative that dehumanized white people existed and said, yeah, white men are serial killers. That didn't happen over a period of time. And so even though it's a representation that we see on TV, we have all of these other representations of what it means to be a white man. We are intimately aware of whiteness, right? Like our teachers, our doctors, our bankers, the people and that we interact with every day give us very different information about what it means to be Black. So that one representation that we see on TV doesn't become the totality of that white experience, right? And so it's really important for us to think about, yes, stereotypes exist about other groups of people, but are those stereotypes intended on dehumanizing them? Do those stereotypes come from a history that was meant to dehumanize somebody so that they could be used as chattel, as labor, as an object? No, we can't say that about other groups of people in the same way that transatlantic slavery existed. So when we're talking about anti-Black racism, it's specifically for these reasons that we're naming it as this very kind of phenomenon that still continues to impact us today. Mahad, is your hand up again, or is that from before?
I was gonna just chime in. If anybody, I'm about to put it in the chat right now. So if anybody wants to get a deeper understanding of how the collective unconscious and the psychological aspects of this, there's a book called Black Skin, White Masks by a guy called Frantz Fanon. He was a psychologist, psychotherapist, used to work in Algeria during the colonialism times, and he's French as well. And he did a very deep analysis on this. So you can definitely check that out. It's a very dope book. Yeah.
Thank you, Mahad. And maybe that's something we can think about, like maybe putting together a list of resources for folks in terms of readings and stuff like that. Sorry, I feel like I'm pronouncing this wrong because
no, you're not. Actually, you're okay. You're doing quite well. It's Sharon. You know what I was thinking about? I was just thinking about just growing up, I'm sure you sort of alluded to this erasure, and that a lot of our history was erased. And so, you know, it's easy to, you know, get in the minds of people when you're not aware of your history when it's been erased. And I can also remember, you know, growing up as a young person, and I remember that in this city, that not being able to find products that were designed specifically for people who look like me. And so what that communicated to me as a young child was that I was a non-person. You know, I was a non-person because they wouldn't even stock the products that I needed. And back then you had to go to like Eglinton to, you know, pick up these products. And that was coupled with, I remember growing up in an environment where it was, you know, a homogenous environment. So I had the double whammy also of being in school, and our history, with the exception of maybe a few sentences related to, you know, a few sentences related to slavery, literally a few sentences. So all of these things combined is communicated to me at a very young age that, yeah, I'm a non-person, I'm not worth, my community is not worth acknowledging. And so thankfully I learned later on that that was not the case.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that. Okay, Sharon, I'm gonna give you the last comment on this, and then the other Sharon who just put their hand down. Was that an accident?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay, no worries. Okay, thank you, Sharon, so much for sharing that, because, you know, and I'm getting to that because one of the other pieces that, let me see if I can share my screen again, and I'm gonna stop sharing again because I just like seeing people. But the other piece that I want us to sort of think about too is colonization, and how even that experience continues to impact Black people today. And so that system of colonialism, was one that really impacts and continues to impact Black people and other colonized people today, because it was a system that provided rewards and punishments based off of your proximity to the European, or based off of your proximity to whiteness. Right? So if we know race is a hierarchy and racism is about a hierarchy, and white is on one side and Black is on the other side, right? What we know is based off of your proximity to whiteness, you would reap more benefits from that system. And based off of your distance from whiteness, you would get more punishments from that system. So in a colonial system, and this happened in all places where colonization existed, those of us who had more proximity to whiteness received more benefits. And so the colorism and the shadeism that we see amongst Black and racialized people is a direct result of this system of colonialism that said, the more you could mimic whiteness, the better off you would be, the more rewards you would receive, right? And so, you know, we a lot of times we talk about hair within the Black community, particularly like Black women's hair and Black women straightening their hair. For a long period of time, we talked about this as if Black women just hated their natural hair, right? Like, oh, we want to mimic Europeans, and so we just hate our hair. And so I was thinking to myself, I remember being a kid, and when I first came to Canada from Ghana, my mom used to do our hair in this very traditional hairstyle. And, I loved that hairstyle. Like, I felt amazing when my mom would do my hair like that. I would go to school and the teachers would like bring me to the front of the class. They would touch it. They would investigate it. They would do this whole situation, right? And so what did I do when I got home that day? I told my mom, never do my hair like that again. Like, I would fight her to do my hair like that. And it wasn't because I didn't like my hair, but it's because of the experience that I then associated to my hair looking like that, right? And so many times we're thinking about the experiences and the rewards and the punishments that we get. We don't straighten our hair necessarily because, I mean, yes, it probably looks good and you look fly and that's great. But a lot of times we know that the more European we can sort of behave, the more rewards we're going to be able to get from the system. And that's a process that we learn through colonization, because the colonial system really rewarded people based off of their proximity to whiteness. And we see that sort of happen today too. We all know what it means to talk with a white voice, right? To put on your white voice when you're calling for an apartment or you're going to a job interview. Even white people perform whiteness, right? Like, all of us know there's a way in which we can perform whiteness to get us access. And people in the middle, all of us in this process of race, participate in this system of whiteness where we perform whiteness because there are rewards that are associated with it, right? And then there are those of us who, for whatever reason, thank you for adding that code switching. And sorry, I'm seeing some stuff come up in the chat. I'm hoping people are engaging because I'm not necessarily having the time, but that being able to really think about this system that benefits us, even me, right? I like anti-Black racism. As you can tell, this is like my life's work. How do we eradicate it? But I also understand how this system benefits me as somebody who has a PhD, who is educated, who has the accent that I have, who's not like, my skin is not that dark, even though I'm dark skinned. I know that all of these things benefit me in a particular kind of way. And so even though I don't get all the benefits, I get some benefits. And so my investment in those benefits means that, am I really committed to eradicating anti-Black racism? Like, I have to stop and ask myself that question, because I have to recognize when this system is actually benefiting me, because that's the way that it works. It wants to keep us invested in the system because that way we don't eradicate it totally, right? So I know, as somebody who's educated, I get way more benefits from this system than somebody who might not be educated in the same way that I am. As somebody who speaks English in the way that I do, right? For me, when I remember growing up, my mom was very invested in me learning how to speak English very quickly when we moved here from Ghana, because she wanted me to get those benefits of speaking English. Now, even though I can speak Twi, I don't speak it that well. And now that's something that I don't like, but it was a part of that system of these benefits that you experience when you're able to assimilate in a particular kind of way, right? So Mahad, did you have another comment?
Yeah, some of the chats in the chat, Jillian said that there's a book called Caste, The Origin of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson, and it looks at how the American caste system and how anti-Black racism is enforced in American society. And then Mina said a quote I find especially useful from this book, which I share when I know I'm challenging my audience and pushing them to learn to grow beyond their comfortable zone, is sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit with their core belief. And another book that was also shared is called Blueprint for Black Power by Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you. And yes, I think that cognitive dissonance and the other thing that I won't have time to talk about today is the confirmation bias and the ways in which bias actually also supports the system as well. And maybe in the next workshop, when we're getting into terms, we can actually go through some of these things to break down what they mean. I'm just going to stop and see if anybody has anything they want to share verbally. I know some folks are sharing in the chat, but are there any thoughts or questions or anything that anybody wants to share? Sorry, Suzanne, I see that your hand's up, but I'm just gonna see if anybody else, since you already spoke, and just see if anybody else wants to jump in. If not, I'll let you go. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other hands up. Susanna, you can go ahead.
So it was just, I was just wondering, are we going to, at any point in the other two sessions, talk about just, due to anti-Black racism, the overpopulation of, Black people in the criminal justice system? Is that
So
something that, is on the menu?
it I haven't actually discussed with Sarah or Jillian what is the actual content for some of the other workshops, but I think maybe in the survey that you'll get after this session, you'll have ideas for what they'd like to learn and talk about that can be, I think, suggested through that process.
Yes, I was going to say that, Evelyn, that the survey that you'll get will ask you like what other areas within this scope of discussion that you'd like us to look into. So yeah, you can put it there, but I'm making a note of that as well.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks. Mahad, can you be really quick? I just wanted to move us a little bit ahead.
I was gonna say, what do you call it? I think whenever people like say like shadeism or colorism, they really are saying anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness, but they don't want to center Black people, because when they do that, it takes them out of the conversation or whatever, something like that happens. So I think it's good just to keep that in mind, right? Because I hear that a lot. Colorism or shadeism, they're really just saying people don't want to be Black, right? Or whatever that is.
Right. I mean, and it definitely is connected to this like larger conversation of anti-Blackness and how shadeism and colorism is a tool of anti-Blackness. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to skip a couple of slides and just kind of move us a little bit forward, because there's two things that I really want us to discuss that will help to also sort of like round out this conversation. If I can share my screen again. So I want to talk about, let's actually start here, racism as a relationship. And I'm going to use the World Cup as a way to just think about how race actually is really about our relationship to each other and our relationship to our own race and other races, right? So here's the World Cup. I don't know if a lot of people watched the World Cup, 2022 World Cup. Who did people cheer for? Who do people go for? If you had to pick the people that you wanted to win within these groups, who did you sort of cheer for? Who were you rooting for in terms of the World Cup for those that participated? And maybe like a more general question, if your country wasn't here represented in the World Cup, what was the next closest country that you voted for, and how did you assess that? Okay, yeah, so we have Mary saying the African countries. And then if there were no African countries, okay, we have Ghana. So Lara, I'm assuming maybe you're Ghanaian? Okay, Nigeria. Okay, but Nigeria wasn't there, so Ghana was the next best choice, I'm assuming. Okay, so we have Deanne saying Canada.
I think she's she's Ghanaian. She's Nigerian.
Yes, so I was saying she's Nigerian. So Ghana, Nigeria wasn't in the World Cup. Ghana was the next.
So I'd like to say, as somebody who is of Jamaican parentage, born in the UK, living in Canada, I get very confused about this question. So I just want to put it out there, and because I look at it, and yes, automatically I look at England because that's where I was born. But do I feel British? Do I feel a connection with this country that I was born in? Do I feel Canadian? I'm not sure. I mean, there's all this. This is about being of the African diaspora. It's about that legacy of slavery. It's about where do I feel as a Black person, do I belong? And I think I also wanted to sort of put it out there in terms of as we look at living in Canada as people, whether we identify as Black, whether we identify as racialized in so many different ways, we bring this understanding of Blackness to the in this mix, and at times it feels very confusing and very because I actually don't always know where I may, because you talk about what are the benefits, what are the privileges you have. Well, sometimes as a Black British woman living in Canada, I can see there are some perks. I've said it because people hear my accent and they go, "Oh, you're British," which is weird because when I came to Canada, it's the first time I actually got called British. I grew up in the UK. Nobody in England would look at me and go, "Oh, you're British," because there's no Black in the Union Jack. So, you know, it's really sort of, I think all these things that we're grappling with and our understanding of anti-Black racism and why it is so, you know, we really need to have this focus is so important, because we're all coming with so many different experiences and we're bringing that to the table, but we also bring in that history and our understanding of Blackness from where we are coming from. In my case, it's been growing up in the UK. For somebody else, it may be about growing up in India. It may be about growing up in Jamaica. You know, we all bring those experiences, and sometimes it doesn't always. Yeah, and I just think this is. I just wanted to kind of like put that out there because it's an important question.
And I think the
we
reason
identify with.
Yeah, and it's a very important comment and thought, because of the way that Blackness becomes this one common experience that the expectation and the assumption is that we all experience our Blackness in the exact same way. So regardless sort of like where we come from, what our histories are, what information we have, there's an assumption about and that's also through that process of slavery and colonization, and also where we even learn about Blackness, that really just makes Blackness this one experience that everybody kind of has in the same kind of way. And so when people are struggling to kind of like locate themselves within this conversation and feeling like, well, I'm not, you know, I often hear people say, well, I identify as like African Canadian. I don't know why you're saying Black, or I don't even want to identify as being connected to the continent. For example, I'm from the Caribbean, and these kinds of like nuances around like our identities and Blackness. And, you know, there's very complicated conversations that I'm not sure we have enough of about East African, particularly lighter skinned Black people who have some European features because of their proximity to Europe. So I'm thinking my Somali people, my Eritrean people, my Ethiopian people, who also have a history of struggling with people telling them they're not Black enough, or that they are Black, and the anti-Blackness that kind of plays out in that context as well, right? And so I remember actually a Somali auntie from Delta actually told me this story one day where she was like, you know, when she first came to Canada, she would warn her kids not to hang out with Jamaicans, because there was this narrative that Jamaicans were bad and they were criminals and etc. And she goes, a few years later, somebody was telling their kids not to hang out with Somalis, right? And so like interesting the ways in which like we actually end up like this, the way that anti-Blackness plays out amongst ourselves, especially when there's these different ways in which Blackness impacts us. We either have access to Blackness or we don't have access to Blackness. And it creates all of these other outcomes, right? Yeah, you know, and then there's this conversation folks are having around Morocco and are Moroccans African and the World Cup and anyways, that's a different conversation for another day. But all that to say, really important for us to start being very aware of the diversity of the Black experience, and that the Black experience is not this monolithic a thing that all of us experience in the same kind of way. I think it was Sarah who was sharing, you know, coming from Sarah, what did you say? Jamaica? Yes, like, and not having to ever think about Blackness, right? You never have to think about the fact that you're Black until you immigrate to a place where all of a sudden people are constantly calling you Black all the time. And you're like, okay, like, how do I reconcile this, never having to deal with this identity in this kind of way? And the one thing I'd like to tell people is the one thing that we can all agree on as Black people that we all have in common is the experience of anti-Black racism. Other than that, we actually are very, very, very different. And that's the thing that we also have to think about in terms of how we organize as Black people. Because if we're organizing around this thing that is about suffering, actually, it's about dehumanizing, how does that impact how we even interact with each other, right? Like it does actually shift. We're not interacting always from a place of joy. It's always around this experience of anti-Blackness. And so how do we actually start to think through that in a way that allows us to, you know, not, I think it was maybe Kemi who sort of earlier talked about like that internalized anti-Black racism that comes from what we know about Black people, how it creates an internalized anti-Black racism. Some of us are trying to distance ourselves from the continent, and some of us are trying to be more connected to the continent. And even that is creating, you know, you're not Black enough, you're not African enough, you're not this enough, or I don't even want to be this. I don't want to be African, I don't want to be connected, right? So all of these different kind of experiences that are directly connected to that anti-Blackness is something that we really have to interrogate and take seriously. Okay. I want to move on and talk about two things, which is model minority and brown complicity. Because again, we're talking about racism and anti-Black racism, really understanding the system that benefits and rewards and punishes. And for those of us that work in diverse communities, and when I say racially diverse communities, like we're working with people who are South Asian and East Asian, and we're working with, we're just working in diverse spaces, Latina, Latinx, et cetera. And we're oftentimes put in a place where we're being positioned to work against each other in these kinds of spaces, especially when we start talking about racism and anti-Black racism. So a model minority is a term that you might, some of you might be familiar with. Model minority refers to minority demographic whose members are perceived to achieve a higher degree of socioeconomic success than the population average, thus serving as a reference group to compare other minority groups to. The model minority myth was created to take away from the impact of anti-Black racism and replace it with, you're just not working hard enough. The model minority rewards model minorities and keeps them complicit within the system, and it contributes to this oppression Olympics. Characteristics that are normally associated with model minorities is smart, so naturally good at math, naturally good at science and technology. They are wealthy, hardworking, self-reliant. They are docile, they don't push back, submissive, obedient, and uncomplaining, spiritually enlightened, and never in need of assistance. And so this term model minority is important for us to unpack in terms of the ways in which the model minority is created as a way to undermine this experience of anti-Black racism and racism generally, right? And so the ways it positions, we know, hold on, let me stop sharing again so I can see the chat. Sorry, I'm going to keep going back and forth. I hope that's not making anybody dizzy, but I can't see the chat when I'm sharing for some reason. So we can identify who model minorities are, particularly within the Canadian society, right? I think many of us know these are folks who are usually identify as like Chinese or Asian, South Asian, brown, tend to be the model minorities, but even within that group, it's still a hierarchy, right? Which still puts like Asian, Chinese people on top of South Asian people as well, right? And so this narrative about how good these people are and look how hard they work to be successful is a way to then undermine that Black experience and say, well, these people also are different and experience racism. How come they're able to be successful within the system? How come their outcomes don't look the same as Black people's outcomes? And then it turns the conversation as a question of Black people just not wanting to be better, right? Like we are choosing this experience. It's an individual experience that has nothing to do with the systems, nothing to do with the structures, and nothing to do with this history that exists. It's because you are just not working hard enough. And so that narrative of that model minority and how it undermines when we're trying to talk about anti-Blackness is very important for us to consider when we're working in spaces with people who are considered part of that model minority category, because of what it might mean for the kind of dynamic that's created in that kind of space. And for those folks who are part of that category, and how you then work with other racialized people, Black people who are not part of that model minority, I guess, category, right? For lack of a better word. Susanna and then Mahad.
I'll be quick, I'm so sorry.
No.
So I think like that just like hit, especially when I was asking to speak about the overpopulation and the of Black people in the criminal justice system, because I remember having a really serious conversation with someone. They were of Asian descent, and it was in regards to me talking about like how that's such a problem. Like, do you not see a problem here? Well, who makes them get in trouble? Like they get themselves in trouble. Like, and it was all about, well, you're Black, you put yourself in there. And it was like, I'm not having the conversation. I'm not saying that committing the crime wasn't wrong and not their fault. What I'm saying is how they got into that. You know what I mean? being an at-risk youth, the trauma, all that stuff. So I think like that's like a huge thing because we have this ring around our head. And I think it, again, we were speaking about, I'm so sorry, Mahat said it earlier. I'm sorry, last minute, I'll come back to me. But you know, these thoughts in our head that we don't really, unconscious, my coffee hasn't really settled. But you know, we just assume that like, oh, well, they're Black, so they put themselves there. And it's like, well, do you know all the like all the issues that as being a Black person they've dealt with, young Black men, like, you know what I mean? So that's what I felt like really came to me, because I think that there's a lot of people who have that thought process in their head and doesn't allow them to really take in, you know what I mean? Like,
of course.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mahat?
Yeah, just to sort of, what do you call it, add to the discussion here. I think it's there's a whole movement currently in the United States called the Foundational Black Americans, and it's basically a movement that makes the argument that Black Americans were the ones who basically led to the opening up of immigration and allowing all of these other, what is it called, Black and non-Black groups to enter the country and take advantage of it, right, through all the civil rights activities. And a lot of these groups came to America and just sided with the white master society. And the foundational Black Americans are basically making the argument like, hey, you know, if you're going to come here, and at least if you're a Black, and you come here and you don't come in and you're not part of the struggle, like we were the ones that opened up the doors for you through all of our activities and fighting back through, you know, et cetera, right? So you should definitely check it out. Just Google Foundational Black Americans and some things shall pop up. Also, in regards to the justice system, sorry, I'm putting in the chat right now a documentary that's also very interesting. It basically maps out how slavery wasn't actually removed or abolished, but it was sort of transitioned into the prison system, and all the things that happened from the time from when slavery got like officially taken off the books to how it actually got transitioned into the system. And it just became legal to, you know, become a slave as long as you're in prison.
Shackled in the world are locked up here in the land of the free.
I think somebody clicked what you shared. Okay, thank you.
So just check that out. And yeah,
thank you. If you have any other resources, I'm just looking at time. If we could just maybe just put it in the chat, and then again, maybe we'll work on a resource thing, folks. I think Jill hand up.
Yeah, I just want, and I just wanted to sort of speak a little bit to, you know, what we're talking about here in terms of the model minority, and also look at how colonialism, you know, how it was taken through the across the world, and how it's impacted at every level, you know, in the African continent and the Asian continent, and how that has informed where we are now as we talk about this, you know, the concept of the model minority, that, you know, that's still that hierarchy of that was being created by this dominant group, i.e. white folks, who have then created this hierarchy of others. So, you know, it's the benefits where we may feel that there's some sense of benefiting, that some may benefit from that, but it's a double-edged sword, because those benefits are not changing the structure. We're reinforcing this colonial mindset across the board. So, you know, wherever there is this sort of like, it's about those individuals, i.e. it's about Black people who are not doing well, that gets perpetuated maybe through other communities, it's actually impacting those communities as well, because they themselves are also part of that structure of hierarchical thinking. And that's why I do draw reference to the book Cass, because I think she explains that really well in terms of how dominant societies and hierarchical structures are created, and just really interesting. Yeah, just wanted to raise that.
I'll add two things to just this conversation really quickly, because there is a study that the TDSB actually came up with, I think it was last year, around the model minority, if people, and how that's actually impacting Asian and South Asian students, because they are expected to always excel, and the kind of pressure that actually puts on students because of this narrative around the model minority. And that's really causing a lot of students to have a lot of crises within the school system, because there's this expectation that they're going to go into the sciences and the maths and the technology. So those of them who are more interested in the arts don't really get taken seriously in those spaces. But then also like the really high expectations that and the pressure that comes from this model minority. So again, to your point, Jillian, like while it's seemingly this benefit, this category that benefits people, it's actually it causes harm to those who are considered model minority as well. And if you actually look at the history of the domestic worker program in Canada, which domestic worker program historically started with Jamaican women, and Jamaican women were able to come to Canada as domestic workers. And then over time, they actually changed the domestic worker program to benefit Filipino women. And the reason why that is because Filipinos are considered part of this model minority category. And they say that these women are more docile. They're less likely to like push back and resist the kind of conditions that the domestic workers were meant to work under. And so again, you see how this model minority, it seemed to privilege folks, but also it is this double-edged sword that then becomes harmful. Okay, I had a case study that I want us to actually pivot to. I'm not getting through all my slides today, but that's okay. And I'm hoping people can really participate in this, and through the chat, if you'd like to. Yeah, I went to U of T, and the Asian students were most stressed out during exams, especially the Chinese students. And there's actually an article that came out. Sorry, I know I was going to pivot, but just to that point, JR, there was this article that was called Too Asian that came out in Maclean's magazine like a few years ago. That was where like white students were complaining about the amount of Asian students that go to universities like U of T, because they were saying that these students oftentimes excel, and that was making it harder for them somehow. Like, it's a really interesting article that was demonstrating this like anti-Asian kind of like racism too, that was also connected to this like narrative around the model minority. So that's another resource if people sort of want to read about this thing. So I think today we've had a lot of conversation. I kind of want to bring it home and kind of make it a little bit more real in terms of how we think about how everything we've talked about around the Black experience really impacts everyday mundane situations. And so the case study that I've kind of put together here. So this person A, lives at 2045 Kipling Avenue in a high-rise building that has 24 floors. At least twice a week, one of the 3 elevators go out of service. The question I have for you all, and I want us to talk about, is how does this elevator going out of service impact this person? Okay, so we have a person that lives in a high-rise building. I'm thinking most people on the call are from the West End, so you know Kipling and Steeles. If not, then you know it's pretty north. Yes, north, right? Somebody help me with my geography. Okay, I see some nodding.
We're northwest.
Northwest, thank you, northwest. And so this elevator, one of the elevators in this high-rise building continues to go out of service at least twice a week. How does this elevator going out of service impact somebody?
Going to work, going to school. It will
Okay.
impact them going to the kids to the school, and they will be late.
Right.
They will all hear latecomers, so something like that will get labels.
Right. Okay. So this person misses the elevator is late. Let's work through the one example of school. They are late to school because the elevator is not working. What happens to students when they are late? And I know we have some of the SFA student staff. I think I saw a few names on the call. When students are late going to school, what happens to them?
Sent to the office.
They get sent to the office. Yes. And then what happens when they're late more than a couple of times or a few times?
Well, they miss out on the learning, like whatever the teacher is teaching, they're missing out on that.
Right.
They could be expelled, right? They could be expelled.
Right, they could be expelled.
And they also made an example of, so now it's like, yeah, that's the guy that, got kicked out, like, you know, because the principal comes, I don't have any kids in school, but I was a kid. The principal comes to the door, and then you know why the principal is there, because you get to walk out, so now everybody knows. So there's that shame associated with, and the question becomes, as a child, what do I do with that shame, right? Yeah, but you know, eventually you get kicked out. So now that impacts, for me, that impacts your parents, because now do they have to stay home? Is there somebody in the home to stay with you? Like the ripple effects are tremendous, especially if you're a new mom to this country and I'm an immigrant, and endless.
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
Can I share? Oh, I know.
Yeah,
Sharon.
who was that? Sorry, I don't know.
Deanna.
Deanna.
It's Deanna. I'm having a bad hair day, so I won't show my face. I'm just playing, but it's funny that you brought this up, because I was that child who I grew up in Tanridge. Well, I lived there when I was young, and the elevator we would get stuck in it often. And that traumatized me to the point where I don't want to live in a building. And there was sometimes we would go to get the elevator, and the elevator wasn't there. Like, it was empty, like it was unsafe. Like, it was, the door would open, but there was nothing there. So just being a child, this was in the 80s, I think I was about 4. So I'm 4 years old, and I could still, I'm still, living through that. I'm not afraid to go in the elevator, but I just don't want to live in a building with an elevator unless it's, I don't know. Yeah, just terrified of elevators. So that I could only imagine, like, a lot of the kids and families that we work with, the families that I work with right now live in buildings, and just the ripple effect that it has. Like, I'm 38 years old, and I still remember being a 4-year-old going to get the elevator and it doesn't show up, or I'm stuck in it for like 3 hours. Those were like a long time, back then. So I know it's not that long now. They intervene like quickly, but it's terrifying.
Yeah, no, actually, I don't know if that's true. Like, I'm actually coming out of working at TCHC, and one of the biggest challenges that we hear from tenants all the time is around elevators. And this is why I'm even coming up with this example, because it's something that we don't necessarily think about the fact that, so if we look at the outcomes that exist for Black people, we know more Black people live in social housing, for example, or more Black people live in places where, so yeah, I think, Deanna, this is what you were getting to. You wouldn't, if you were living in a condo that had that same experience. But if you're living in a social housing, or in an area that is considered to be underprivileged and under-resourced, your experience of that elevator changes, right? And so part of why I wanted to really unpack this case study around the elevator and how it changes people's experience. So I want to go back to Sugar's comment, actually. And so let's think about, you're a student. Let's say you tell your teacher, and I've seen this happen from working in the school system, I'm late because I was stuck on the 401. And how that is actually a different experience from being a Black student and saying, my elevator didn't work, right? Because when we go back to the initial example where I was thinking about the stereotypes that are associated with Black people, what are the stereotypes that are associated with Black students? Well, they don't care about school. They don't care to be on time. And so when you show up late as that student and you tell the teacher, well, you know what, like, the elevator wasn't working. And I think it was JR, somebody in the comment that said, well, they could take the stairs, right? Okay, fine, maybe they could take the stairs. But what if you're somebody like me who grew up in housing, who has 5 sisters, right? And we don't know the elevator is not going to work that day. So we get up our regular time. All of us have to take 4 to 6 minute showers, if even that, because you don't want the hot water to run out for the next person. There's one washroom, right? And so you're going through all of these things in the morning to get to school on time, just for you to leave your house, you get to the elevator and the elevator is not working. Okay, you could rush down the stairs, but you rush down the stairs, and if you live at Kipling, where are you? You're not close to the subway station. You're waiting for that bus that's all the way at Kipling and Steeles, for example. And many of us that live in the Northwest are not close to a subway station, right? So the rapidness of the subway, we don't get those benefits, actually. So we have to wait for the bus. And if you miss that bus, what happens? Okay, then you're late. And I've heard from students, Black students, say if they're late for school, they just won't go. right? They just won't go because, to your point, I think it was Sugar who was saying the shame that becomes associated with the way the teacher singles you out when you're late, you just decide you're not going to go. And so that results in the suspensions and the expulsions that we see. And this is just because of an elevator, right? And so really thinking about how that Black experience and the stereotypes that are associated with Blackness impact somebody's experience when something like an elevator. So the elevator is going to impact everybody in that building. Yes, Black or not Black, but the stereotypes that are associated with the anti-Blackness are not going to impact everybody in that building. And again, let's say you're somebody that has, we can layer on so many pieces to this conversation. You have a disability, you can't take the stairs, right? You are also responsible to drop off your siblings at school because maybe your parents left in the morning, or are working or are sleeping. There's all of these ways in which this thing, which is just about an elevator, get impacted, changes your experiences because of the ways in which like the stereotypes around anti-Blackness impacts people. And then we go to parents or adults who are having to go to work, right? Does this elevator not working mean that you might lose your job because people are not going to have the same empathy or the same understanding for you? Because being late because of an elevator is different than being late because you were stuck on the 401, right? Like these are different experiences, and these are different experiences when we layer on that race piece into the conversation as well. And so when, sorry, I see. Okay, yeah, I was just checking some of the comments in the chat. So really, and then sorry, going back to Deanna's comments around like the trauma that becomes associated with this situation around the elevator and how that that impacts us into our adulthood and so many different areas. You're thinking about how many of us have had this challenge with an elevator, particularly because we grew up in under-resourced, underprivileged areas, and buildings that are not maintained, for example, and all of these other pieces. And we know that Black people have higher, because of poverty, because of being overrepresented in these other areas, we will live in these areas more than other people. And so the kinds of ripple effect that happens because of something that seems as mundane as an elevator. So I have about like maybe one more minute, and then I'm going to throw it back to Jillian and Sarah. And sorry, the time flew by. I knew 2 hours wasn't going to be enough, but you know, we do what we can with what we have. But I want you all to think about, as like service providers, as people that work in community, these mundane kind of experiences, when we layer on this stereotypes and the anti-Blackness, how does that change that outcome? I think it was Susanna, you were talking about the justice system. Well, if we think about this elevator, how did this elevator actually create an overrepresentation of Black people in the justice system? Because if I'm avoiding going to school, or if I'm getting suspended because I'm late, that pushes me out of the school system and into other things, right? So we know about the school to prison pipeline and how that works. But what about like the social housing to prison pipeline? That actually means that those people who live in social housing actually have higher chances of getting involved within the justice system because of the conditions that exist within these communities. And this experience isn't the same across the board for all people who live in social housing or who live in under-resourced communities, because the ideas and the stereotypes and the narratives that we have about Black people change the outcome of these situations, right? And so really, I think the thing I want you all to leave this conversation with is really thinking about that, right? And so when we have programs that are targeting and focusing more on Black people and supporting Black people, this is an equity approach. This is about understanding this history, understanding that there are limited resources, there are experiences for Black people that are much different than other people. And so when we are taking this approach to say, let's have some more spaces where we can support Black people, Black families, and Black communities to do well, this is really because of this history of anti-Blackness. And that's why it's very important for us to name anti-Blackness for what it is and not conflate it and say, you know, why are we not doing this for these other groups of people, and sort of that oppression Olympics kind of conversation. So I hope everything I've shared today, or at least a couple of things I've shared today, have helped people to move from, you know, if you're in the fear zone, it's helped you to get a little bit closer to the learning zone. If you're in the learning zone, it's helped you to get a little bit closer to the growth zone. And if you were nowhere on that chart, it's actually prompted some questions for you that you will take into your work as we move forward. Thank you so much for having having me. And I'm going to throw it back to Jillian and Sarah and Mahad for final words.
Thank you, Evelyn. I know this was really awesome, and I think everyone will agree. We just want to quickly share the outcomes again, as we are going to share a evaluation piece with you. And we would want you to outline if you think the objectives were achieved and what we can do for the other one. So we will email you the survey after we have ended. Jillian, final words?
Yes, so just want to say thank you to Evelyn. That was great, and there's a lot to unpack in this whole discussion, and this is why we felt we really needed to break it down into 3 parts. So we'd really like to hear from everybody. Just please, if you can make a real effort to complete the evaluation form that Sarah will be forwarding to everyone. I mean, we feel like we've just touched a little bit of the iceberg here, but we really want to move the discussion on. So in the new year, please, watch out for our part 2 and part 3. I think part 2 is going to be a really important discussion around, how understanding of the terminologies, because we make all kinds of assumptions, I think, even for ourselves, like, oh yeah, I get this, or maybe I don't get it, maybe I do need to really understand what does this mean. And I know Sarah and I've had lots of discussions about what does racialized really mean, and particularly for those of us who are not Canadian, who don't see ourselves as Canadian necessarily, not a terminology we're familiar with. And we want it to be a discussion where it's okay to say, actually, I don't really understand that. Can someone please help me kind of, get my head around this? So that's part 2, and in the new year, terminologies. And so, looking at the outcomes for today, really, thinking about that, okay, what else do you feel you would find really beneficial as we have these further discussions around anti-Black racism? So thank you for taking the time today, really looking forward to for you to join us again for future workshops, and we will be sending out more information about our capacity building workshops, our monthly workshops. We had moved this workshop to, it's not the last Friday in the month, but we will be having our workshops on the last Friday in the month, and we will be kind of sending them. And we want to hear from you. What kind of topics would you also, you would like to see us, for these workshops? So, because this is very much coming from yourselves. And so.